Now, concerning the things about which you wrote. So Paul is addressing some things that the Corinthians had wrote to him. And obviously this was one of them. The issue about where they're coming from now into their newness life of Christ. They're wondering, you know, this religion let us do all this stuff, but we need to ask you, where does God stand with that? Where does our faith in Jesus Christ stand? So Paul's answering that. He's now concerning the things about which you wrote. He says, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, but because of immorality, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. The husband must fulfill his duties to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but her husband does. And likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. All right, so we're going to stop there a little bit. Paul starts that out with, it is not good for a man or to touch a woman. Now, obviously, what's he saying there? Don't all speak at once. Exactly, Scott. He's saying that if you are not married, you are not to have relationships with someone else, even though you're not cheating on your wife. If you're a single man, you're still not to have relationships with another person, because the sanctuary of marriage God set up in Genesis, and to God marriage is a holy thing, and we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. So he's not just talking here about married men, women having affairs. He's talking about any man, any person that is single. They are to abstain from that kind of relationship. And so he said it's not good for a man to do that. But then he says in verse 2, but because of immorality, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. Then he goes on to talk about a man must fulfill the duties to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. So when we marry, we have certain obligations as marrying somebody that God expects out of us. A man is supposed to take care of his wife. He's supposed to take care of her needs. He's supposed to watch over her and provide for her. And that's our duties as husbands, to do that. Also, God gives duties for a wife, and that is to love her husband and to take care of him. And so he's talking about the duties that we have, that we are to do them, because those duties are instituted by God. But then he goes into a part I don't like talking about. We're going to anyway. Go ahead.
I just going to say that it's very easy. The King James version, number 2, it says, "But out the river unto his wife benevolence." And if you look into the definition of what that is, it's accurate conduct, conjugal, which is an interesting book.
And some of the times we need to be aware of what our wife's needs are. I'll give you an example because I fall short all the time. Laura, the other day, she was going to do something. I'm not, and I think it was with Janet. She had something she wanted to do, and her and Janet were going to go do it. And I'm studying, And this week I've got, tonight I've got Sunday school class morning I'm teaching, and then I'm doing the sermon Sunday for Frank while he's gone. And so I got a lot of studying all week. And when I do that, it takes me all week studying. I don't have a lot of time to do other things. And as Laura walks out the door, she says, "Man, it would sure be nice if you did the dishes while I'm gone." And I thought, you know what? I'm busy. I got a lot of things on my mind, a lot of things to do. And I said, well, probably not. They'll probably be here when you get back. And she left. And I went back to studying. Man, I had to close my Bible. I went in there, and I not only did the dishes, I cleaned the whole kitchen, drain boards and everything. She still hadn't come back, so I went back to studying. And then when she came in, she was just shocked. But that's what Paul's trying to get across here, is we have obligations to our spouse to go the extra mile. It's not just, watching over her and taking care of her and making sure she has food on the table and those things. It's getting in and helping her with some things like, I was busy. I had a good excuse for not wanting to go do the dishes. But God didn't let me sit on that excuse. I used it and it didn't do me any good. And that's because that's the relationship that God has set up with a man and a woman. We're to look more at just the physical things that are out there, to taking care of our spouse. We're to take care of them inside their heart, our heart, doing things for them just because we love them, not because we have an obligation to. And so, Philip, I'm glad you brought that up because it ties into what I was saying. But here's what else he says when he goes into verse 4. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, also the husband does not have authority over his own body, the wife does. Stop depriving one another. For me, in my life, the relationship with my wife. That part of the relationship. And Paul's trying to bring it out here. That part of the relationship between a man and a woman. It's something that God instituted when he put man and woman together. In Genesis, God said, therefore a man shall leave his mother and be joined, mother and father, and be joined together with his wife, and they will become one flesh. So part of that intimate relationship that we have with our wife or husband binds us together. It cements our marriage. And Paul's saying that we need to be thoughtful. We need to think about our spouse's needs. And because that is so important in a marriage, that God understands the intimacy between a man and a woman and what that's supposed to be in the Lord. And so he's telling us that we don't have authority over our own body. Our spouse does. And so he says, don't deprive that. Don't take away that intimate relationship with your spouse because they might need it. And sometimes, I hate teaching on this. It's not easy to do. But it is. It is that intimate relationship that we have with our spouse. You guys that are married, you know that. So I don't even have to explain it. But it is so important. And Paul has made a point of it here. Don't neglect doing that. Don't deprive each other of that, except for a time. There's a time when if you both come in agreement that you spend in prayer and devotion to God, Paul said that's fine. Don't You can do that, but then come back to it. Come back to that relationship. Scott. To be treated. You know, and it is very true. And I hear of people all the time complaining about that issue, and a lot of times that leads to divorce. And the Bible says God hates divorce. He hates it. Go ahead, Levi.
To share a piece of my testimony about my first wife. This was in my teens and 20s, early 20s. It didn't survive to my mid 20s. I was still addicted to porn, so we'll use an analogy here. I was getting takeout and she was going hungry. And eventually somebody else gave her food. And then she was better off, so we got divorced. But I know how intimacy is the glue, and when there was none of it, Satan came in and drove a wedge between us and we got divorced. And that was that. I learned the lesson, but it's insidious when we're getting our needs met from something other than our spouse. It's very important that we rely on each other.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments about that? No. Okay. Let's go on. Verse 6, okay? We've talked about, he says, do not deprive each other of that experience because it is so vital to the marriage. Then in verse 6, he says this, but this I say by way of concession, not of command. Yet I wish that all men were even as myself, even as I am myself. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, that is good for them, that they remain even as I. But if you do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. You know, and as Paul, I believe at one time was probably married. Paul was a Pharisee before he got saved. He was a Pharisee, and he was a devout Pharisee. Pharisees were almost always married because the Pharisees taught about the family dynamics and the importance of it. So most Pharisees were married, but it wasn't a command. They didn't have to be. But it was thought that Paul at one time was married and that either his wife died or in Judaism, when one spouse leaves Judaism to another, you can divorce your spouse. So when Paul converted to Christianity, his wife could have divorced him through Judaism because it was allowed in Judaism. So it was thought either Paul's wife died or she divorced him. And that's why Paul says, I wished all men were even as I am, not married, single. What would be the advantage to that? Why is Paul saying that that's an advantage? Janet. Abs- absolutely. Is and we're going to look at some different things here, but those who are married they have more than just themselves to worry about. They have their wife, they have their children, they have the home, they have to get a job to support all of those things that we just looked at, taking care of our spouse. And that's God's job for us to take care of our spouse. So when we're married, we cannot give 100% of our time and effort into following the Lord Jesus Christ, because we have an obligation to our wife and to our family. The thing about it is Jesus says still at that, I have to be first. You still have to put me first in your life before your wife, before your kids, before your family or your house or your job. Jesus still has to be first. But a person that's married has that, they can still put God first and they can still do everything they can, but they can't give 100% of their time. A guy that is single or a woman that is single can devote their whole life to Christ and can do the things that the Lord wants her to do or him to do. You know, and I think about Peter. And Peter is my favorite character in the Bible because he was a gruff old fisherman that said what was on his mind. And it got him in trouble with Jesus a lot. But it also showed that he had faith a lot deeper than some of the others. But Peter is the only apostle that was mentioned that was married. So Peter was married, and he had a family, and he had a wife. And yet, he served God with all of his heart and with all of his soul. And you think about what that must have did for their marriage, because Peter followed Christ wherever he went. He put his Lord before his wife and before his children. And so Peter would have had that conflict inside, you know, whether I should follow Christ 100% or if I need to. He would probably feel guilty when he spent so much time away from his family. But yet he still found the balance of where to put relationship with his Lord. I remember reading Billy Graham's story. And Billy Graham's son, Franklin Graham, when Billy was doing all these revivals and preaching, and he spent a lot of time away from home. And his son resented that because Dad was never there for him. Dad wasn't home. And so through his years, he rebelled a little bit. And it ended up in the latter years of Billy's life that his son ended up becoming just like him. And Franklin Graham now has a ministry that is almost as big as Billy's was, but Franklin's ministry goes out around the whole world. And so, yeah, his family suffered for him devoting so much time to God, but yet God blessed that in the end. Okay, and so God will work them parts out, and that's why Paul says, "Man, you're better off if you can stay single, if you can handle that." But it's not for every man, and it's not for every person, because he says here. You know, let's go ahead and go on. He says in 7, I wish every man was like myself, unmarried. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner and one in another. Being able to be a single person following Christ totally is a gift from God. Being a married man, having a family, raising up your family in the ways of the Lord is a gift from God. So they're both. God is perfectly satisfied whichever way you choose, whether you decide to stay single, follow him, or whether you decide to to marry and have a family, God still blesses you. He doesn't bless one more than the other because they're both important. Okay? And he goes on to say, but I say to the unmarried and to the widows, that it is good for them if they remain even as I. But if you do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. If a person is able to handle that, that's why we said in the first part, if a person stays single, but they still burn with lust and still have relationships with the opposite sex, being single has done you no good. In fact, you're sinning because you're having that relationship outside of marriage. And so Paul is saying is if you can't control that, then it's fine to marry so that you don't burn with lust, that you do have that intimate relationship with your spouse that God had originally intended. But then he goes on to say this in verse 10. But to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband, but if she does leave, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce the wife. But to the rest I say, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband, and he consents to live with her, he must not send her away. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. Yet, if the unbeliever one leaves, let him leave. The brother or sister is not under bondage in such case, but God calls us to be at peace. So how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your own wife? Do you have a comment? You know, God hates divorce. And so Paul here has listed some things about divorce. And that a man is not supposed to leave his wife and a wife not to leave her husband. And if it gets into a shape where there's one believer and one's not, you're still to stay with that spouse. Because he says, who knows that you might not save your spouse by your life, Christ.
So when it's talking in this way, do you think it's speaking of if you remain with them, even though one is believing and one's not believing, and your relationship remains like it was, you're still giving due diligence to that one, even though they're not a believer, you are helping them to remain faithful to that one that they are married to, even though they are not equally yoked as far as faith is concerned. And so they're not burning with passion towards someone else.
Correct.
So that's what it's really trying to tell us, is that if you're married, give due diligence to the one you're married. Because otherwise, they're going to sin. You're causing them to have a desire for someone else. Which if you leave them or you don't give them due diligence, you're pushing them into a situation where it's easier for them to want to go somewhere.
To want to go.
Yeah.
Dan, if you mind if I share your story with you and Dane?
It's
Can
okay.
yes, no.
Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
Janet and her husband Dane were married when they were very young. And Janet ended up getting saved. Dane didn't. And Janet continually prayed for Dane. And it had caused some friction in their marriage because she was a believer and Dane wasn't. And so Janet was talking to God about it. And God told her, Janet, you stay loyal to me and let me take care of Dane. How many years were you and Dane married? 49? A year before Dane passed, he got saved. We started a Wednesday night Bible study. And Janet and Dane started coming to that Wednesday night Bible study. And I remember Janet saying sometimes she would say, Dane, let's skip tonight. And Dane would say, nope, we're going to Bible study. And in that class, when I started it, I started it for new believers. And Dane made sure he came. And he got to a point where he started seeing what salvation was about. So he went and talked with Pastor Carl. Long story short, Dane ended up getting saved and giving his life to God. Janet stayed faithful for him 49 years. God kept his promise to Janet. Janet stayed serving God all that time. And God ended up saving Dane like he promised he would. He told her, Janet, you stay true to me. Let me take care of Dane. And God did. Levi.
Yeah, it's the idea of sticking with it is so beautiful, and in such a stark contrast to Nehemiah, where everybody was told to divorce, and I was just like, ah! But then here in the New Testament, you see how beautiful it is. It's like, no, stay together, and maybe your being together will help sanctify the other. That's wonderful.
Yeah, and that is quite a story when you go. I think that's the one, or was it Hosea, where his wife ran off and became a prostitute. He went and bought her back. Okay? And so it's whatever God puts on your heart. Um, God will help you in those things if you stay loyal to Him. Okay. And sometimes, I know I've been divorced, and my wife, we were married 20 some years, and she came one day and decided she asked for a divorce, said she doesn't love me anymore. And I fought it for a while, and finally I just said, all right, if that's what you want, you don't love me anymore, and you want a divorce, I'll give you a divorce. And so I did. But I felt guilty because I never really gave God a chance to see if He would work out that marriage. I did not want to stay with a woman that didn't love me. And even though I fought it, there came a day when I finally gave up. And so you never know how God's going to work those things out. But anyway, Jesus talks about this a lot. Let's go to the book of Matthew, chapter 19. And we're going to start in verse 3. Some Pharisees, well, I'll give you time to get there. Yeah, Matthew chapter 19, starting in verse 3. 19. 1, 9. Starting in verse 3. I love this story, though. Some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him, and asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And he answered and said, Jesus answered and said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. Verse 7. They said to him, then why did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? And Jesus said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wife, but from the beginning it has not been this way. Verse 9. Then he says this, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another commits adultery. I love this part. The disciples said to him, if the relationship of a man and a woman is like this, it is better not to marry. A man after my own heart. Peter was married, you know. But anyway, Jesus says this. Not all men can accept this statement, but only those to whom it has been given. And so that comes from God. That gift of being alone, being single. God is going to help you with that. That gift comes from God. And here Jesus said it's actually a gift that God gives you so you can spend your time devoted to him. But what the Pharisees had got messed up was the reasoning of what they said about Moses. Now remember, their comment was, then why did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? Well, let's look at that. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 24. We're going to start with verse 1. Y'all there? When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes, because he hath found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it into her hand and sends her out from her house. And she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. So then it goes on to talk about that. Well, one of the interesting things here was Moses didn't say you could divorce your wife over anything. He says if you find some indecency in her. So I looked up what the word indecently meant in the Hebrew text. And here's what it means. Nakedness of a manner, or being shameful, or improper act, or lewd behavior that brings shame on your husband. Moses didn't say that a man could divorce his wife for anything. He's saying, if your wife does these indecent acts and wanders out in nakedness where other people are, if she acts in a lewd manner and she brings shame to you, Moses said you could write her a letter of divorce. One of the things that Moses didn't say was that you could divorce your wife for adultery. Why do you think that was? He said you could divorce her for lewd behavior or for nakedness in public, but why couldn't you divorce her for adultery? Because if your wife committed adultery or your husband committed adultery, you were to be stoned. You died. In the Old Testament, when you committed adultery, you were sentenced to death. And it was death by stoning. And so he's not talking about if Moses isn't talking about if a man or a woman commit adultery, that you can divorce her, because that was a death sentence. He's saying if a woman goes out and struts her nakedness around other people and does just unspeakable things and lewd acts, and she brings shame to you, then you can divorce her for that. But that was the only reason Moses gave that you could divorce your wife. And the Pharisees were saying that Moses gave us permission to divorce our wife for anything. Well, he didn't. He gave one example why you could divorce your wife, and that was because of her actions, how she acted around other people. If she run naked out down the street or something. And actually, we've seen women run down naked down Main Street in town here. We have. But today's society, you can divorce your wife for anything. You don't even have to have a reason. I just want to be married to her anymore, so I'm going to divorce her. That's never God's intent. And that's what Jesus was saying to the Pharisees. Yeah, Moses permitted that because of the hardness of your heart. But it was never that way from the beginning. Go ahead, Philip.
Brings to mind Joseph and Mary, and how Joseph still kept the privy that she was pregnant. But yet, it is obviously this is the Holy Spirit. But that's one of those situations where this divorce is she's not acceptable. Had Joseph been a different man, that could have been very well been his unbelief.
If he brought that publicly, Mary would have been stoned. You know, and you remember the story where a woman was caught in adultery, and they brought her to Jesus, and they were going to stone her. And Jesus said, "Let him without sin cast the first stone." You know, so that practice stayed through the whole Old Testament. But that's the way God feels about divorce. He hates divorce because it divides the family. It breaks up family union. And some of the I've seen people that have had affairs on each other. Jesus says that is the only reason you can divorce your wife or your husband is for immorality. There's some people that cannot handle being with a person that has broke that trust, that has broke that intimate relationship between a man and a woman. Because some people that is a sacred act from God. And for a person to go to another man or woman to have that relationship, some men and women can't handle that. So the Lord gives them permission to divorce your spouse for that. But on the other hand, I have seen a lot of people that have had affairs on each other and ended up choosing to stay together, and their marriage became stronger than it ever was before. God can heal anything. God can take and heal a family that is broken because of adultery. And so for us as believers, you know, we talked about Paul says every man has his own relationship with God on these issues. Some people can't handle that, some can. Some can work through it. Better is the man who can work through it that winds up deciding not to stay with his wife or husband. But yet, God is the one who can heal all things. I had several hands. Janet, you're first.
One of his examples when he counseled married people was that he glued two pieces of paper together and let it dry. And then he would have the couple try to tear those two pieces together without leaving residue on the end. And that was his example of what divorce does. That regardless of, you know, how, what the reason is, when two people who have come together in marriage and are split apart, they leave residue for the rest of their lives on one another, you know. And I just thought it was the perfect example of, because cleaving means to stick together, to come together. And so I just always thought that. And
That's a great example.
yes,
Because
you know.
it is true. I remember when he taught that.
Uh-huh.
Gee,
I'm thinking about, the parable of the unforgiving servant and how master had a fellow servant that owed him less. He had to throw him in prison until he could pay his family. And, that's like us, and it's like a married couple. It's much easier to forgive than it is to tear it apart and destroy everything. Two lives to one. But I think that the example that Jesus gave us, he forgave us so much. And how can we be blessed with somebody that has offended us, done us wrong? If we don't forgive, he won't forgive us.
you know, and
This is what it is, because we every day, somewhere, we're bringing an offense to the Lord. And yet we ask him to forgive us, and he does.
it is, and I understand that. You know, and I know that God would want us to be able to work those things out. But he also knows each person's heart. And he allows you to divorce your spouse for adultery. And the reason he does is because that relationship that you have with your spouse is supposed to be so intimate that you actually become one with each other. And when one of the spouse breaks that and decides to join that relationship with somebody else, it can devastate that one person. And some people can't get over that. And so he does allow that. But I know that he can heal that too. Okay. Oh, I thought you had a hand up. Levi.
Yeah, this brings to mind the story of the Old Testament as God and his bride went through quite the rocky relationship. And his bride cheated on him left and right for years, and then she got faithful for a while, and then she cheated on him for years, and then she got faithful for a while. And eventually he said, "Enough. You are not my people. I am not your God." And he separated for a time, but after a while he couldn't stay away. He's like, "I've engraved you on the palms of my hands. How can I forget you?" And so for us to not represent the image of God and say, "I'm divorcing you," I can't help but think perhaps God says, is that so easy compared to what he went through and how devoted he was to his covenant, even when she was not upholding his covenant, that we should so easily give up on something that's supposed to be holy? And I can't help but feel the disappointment as he would experience, like, I went through it, can't you go through it too? You see what I'm saying?
That's beautiful.
What's that? Oh.
Beautiful that God has remained faithful even when we were faithless. You know, and when I'm not married, I'm a widow, okay? But I was married before and I got divorced. I didn't have Christ at the time, and I wish I did. I think my marriage would have been a good marriage if I was with Christ in it, you know? My husband was not that husband, but we did. God was speaking on the one that was the believer and the non-believer, and, and the story became to Christ. I'm a believer today, and I stand on that. And I don't have a desire to get married, so I stay quiet. But in my relationship with Christ, I find comfort that He's faithful. Even when I'm not. I have.
And here's the concept we don't look at, but we need to for a second. Is last week in 1 Corinthians when Paul was talking about our relationship with the Lord, okay, and that our bodies belong to the Lord. What he said in 1 Corinthians 6, at the end of it, in verse 16, he's talking about our bodies on our own, and we're not to have relationships outside of the marriage. And in verse 16, he says, "Or do you know that the one who joins himself to a prostitute is one body with her? For he says, the two shall become one flesh." But then in verse 17, he says this, "But the one who joins himself to the Lord is one spirit with him." This is what you're talking about. This is what, when instead of joining yourself to these other things, Paul is saying the one who joins himself to the Lord is one spirit with the Lord. If you guys know the book of Revelation, where it talks about the marriage supper of the Lamb, and the church is Jesus' bride. We are his bride. He is married to us. You talked about he is faithful to us. Okay? We are. But go back and look at the Old Testament, because God was still married to his people, the same as he is with us now. When they turned from him and they worshiped other gods, they broke that covenant. And what did God end up doing with a lot of those? We're dealing with it in our Sunday school class right now. God turned Judah and Israel. He turned them over to all the nations around them. And he destroyed them because they left him and turned their back on him and worshiped other gods. So when you put all of that together, what we talked about tonight, Paul clears it up by saying each person has their own special gift from God. And where that leads you, that's where you're to go. And because not everything fits every person. We belong to God. We belong to Jesus Christ when we give our heart to him. And when we do that, he becomes the number one thing in our life. But we are the number one thing in his life. He is committed to us. He is faithful to us, and he will always be there. My sermon Sunday that I'm going to do is on God's grace. If you can make that come, because there's a lot of really neat things I found in studying that about God's grace. And God's grace is special. So with that, I'm glad I got this out of the way. I didn't like going this direction because it's not an easy, tough topic to talk about. But anybody got any questions or comments? Miss Janet.
I just, Levi was talking about the sanctity of marriage being holy. And in Ephesians 5, it says this, husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up to her, for her. And he kind of mirrors here his relationship with us to the marriage of a man and a woman. So he is so holy and brings his holiness into our lives. That's what he wants for a husband and a wife to be also. to be like he is with the church. So,
And that's,
and the church is us.
and that's where Paul said, you know, be of one spirit with God. Okay? Be joined to him. Put him first. Be joined with the Lord, and you will become one with him. Any other? All right, I got a quick song. We're going to close, and then Laura's going to bring the kids up. We're going to sing happy birthday to all you birthday people, and then go down below for some goodies.